Tänään Vaalirankkurit saa studioon oikean superspesiaali vieraan, sillä vuoroin vieraissa me oltiin taannoin tässä keväällä oliko se syksyllä? Nyt mä menen
helmikuussa, menee, Sami, niin helmikuussa.
Oliko se oli helmikuussa. Trumpin aika on tällaista, että aika vaan menee niin kuin sekaisin, time is a flat circle. Oltiin NPR Politics podcastissa vieraana ja nyt meillä on ilo ja kunnia saada tässä jaksossa vieraaksi tuon podcastin tuottaja Casey Morell.
Ja Caseyn kanssa me jutellaan kaikesta, mitä Trumpin aikana on tapahtunut journalismin puolesta, mitä NPRlle itselle on tapahtunut ja sen lisäksi jutellaan tietysti Euroviisuista, sillä Casey on suuri fani. Casey Morell, welcome to Vaalirankkurit.
Sami, Tomo, kiitos. I'm thrilled to be here.
Perfect, kiitos there. Excellent. You know, I have to say I'm a bit surprised, like when we started scheduling this recording and then you suggested that maybe a bit later option would be better because you have to recover from watching Eurovision. I need to ask, like, how was your experience? Have you been watching Eurovision for long? Like, how's that going on?
I mean, it was very fun. I've been watching Eurovision now, I think, for almost 20 years, which is hard to believe. Like, and for the last several years, COVID notwithstanding, I've had a party, right? So I've had people come over and we watch Eurovision and we eat pizza and we drink beer and we watch all the songs and pick who we think is going to win. And I didn't know how big of a party we were going to have yesterday, so I figured if we scheduled the taping a little bit later in the afternoon for me, the evening for you on Sunday, then it would at least make things a lot safer in case we went a little bit too hard. But it was a very fun time, and everybody at the party had a great time. I had a great time watching, as always.
So let's hear those hot takes. What did you think about Austria and... Are you disappointed for Finland and Sweden for Kai?
I mean, it's surprising to me that if I had to bet going into things who of Finland, Sweden, and Estonia would end up higher, I would not have said Estonia, even though Tommy Cash is very fun to watch. I would have thought that Sweden was going to run away with everything. But Austria just had very clever staging, and I think the song was unique enough that people were like, this is something that we want to see and hear more of. So I'm not surprised that Austria won, but I am a little bit surprised that Finland didn't do as well as I thought it would, and especially Sweden, because I thought Sweden would be the odds-on favorite. But it was a great competition all around, so you can't complain.
Yeah, I think Kai, the people in Kai, the band, just said today that they were a little bit upset because they have been told for 2 months that they are the number one, and now they were number 4, and they kind of took that seriously. I have to mention, like, you follow all things European quite well, apparently, and I remember when I explained to you that we had sort of controversy here in Finland when our president, Alexander Stubb, went to meet Kai instead of Erika Wigman first and kind of showed support for them, and then afterwards texted Erika Wigman that, okay, good luck, and we are, rooting for you. And you just replied me, classic Stubb.
Yeah.
It's just, how are you so deep in this?
I wish I knew. I think that ever since I was young, I've wanted to learn more about the world and know more about the things that are going on outside of the U.S. because there's a very big world that's not just what happens in America. So for a very long time, I've read a lot of news from around the world, and I went to Finland last year on holiday, and Sami, that's where you and I met and how we got in touch for all of this. And basically since then, reading Yle.'s English language coverage of whatever's going on in Finland each day to keep up. And, it was one of those things that when the controversy started where Stubb was interacting more with Kai than with Erika Wigman, I just thought this is just the classic kind of mistake that could be so avoided if someone in an office said, like, you shouldn't do that. But, that sometimes happens.
Yeah, that's the Swedish-speaking Finns. Like they are one tribe. So that was kind of we saw that coming, sort of. But yeah, like happy we are all recovered, at least at some bit, after the Eurovision watch party yesterday. But you are here because we want to learn more about what's going on in the politics sector of America and reporting the politics in the United States of America currently. But first, I would like to hear, how did you end up producing NPR Politics podcast, which is one of the biggest politics podcasts from America?
Yeah, so I've worked in the public radio space here in the U.S. for practically my entire career. And when I moved to Washington, D.C. about 6.5 years ago to work at NPR specifically, I was working on our evening news program, which is called All Things Considered. And I worked there for a few years. And I thought, I'd like to try something different. I've never really worked on a podcast before. I'd like to specialize in something in one field of coverage rather than having to do a lot about a lot of different things. And when there was an opening that came up on the NPR Politics podcast, which, I'd been listening to for years, I said, this seems like it would be a very fun time, especially this was, in 2022. So we were gearing up for midterm elections for the Congress, and the presidential race for 2024 had already started in earnest. So I said, I'll apply for this and see if I can get a job there. And I was lucky enough to be hired onto the podcast. And I've been there now for just over 3 years. And in that time of 3 years, I feel like 30 years worth of news has happened.
And I think that NPR is like the American equivalent to Yle here in Finland. Can you explain a little bit to our audience, like, how does NPR work? Where does it get its funding? And how does it compare to Yle?
So it's similar and it's different in a lot of different ways. About 99% of the American population lives within broadcast range of an NPR station. NPR reaches about 29 million people on the radio every week. And when you combine the radio with the internet and with social media and with our app, that number goes up to about 43 million people. So in terms of scale, like it's pretty big in that sense. But where there are some big differences are, YLE, correct me if I'm wrong, there's like a YLE tax. Everyone has to pay a certain percentage every year to fund YLE. So that kind of tax doesn't exist in the US, either for NPR or for PBS, which is our public television system. The main sources of revenue for NPR come from corporate sponsorships. So companies that are paying money to have messages on our programming that are like, we have a car, you can buy this car, or there's a new movie that's coming out or something like that. And then fees that are paid by NPR members to support the programming that NPR puts on. So the way that it works is kind of like a franchise system. It's almost more similar to something like a McDonald's, right? Where you have a corporate headquarters that is telling you, like, here is this program, or here is this new item, or this new thing. And a bunch of independently owned McDonald's then sell that product or provide that product. In contrast to YLE, where it's like, if you're listening to YLE in Helsinki, and there's a Helsinki radio station that's specifically for that, the people who are working for that radio station work for YLE. And here, if you're listening to NPR in New York or Los Angeles or here in Washington, D.C., those people don't work directly for NPR. They work for a company that plays and provides NPR programming. So structurally, we're just very different in that sense because it's much more diffuse and indirect as opposed to just being like directly from the broadcaster all the way down.
That's really interesting. And I think from Finnish point of view, what's like very different is that there's ads. For example, if we listen to Politics podcast here in Finland, on Spotify or whatever, and there are the ad placements in between, and here in Finland, like I work for Wiley, and when I was more on air, like I worked for a radio station a couple of years ago, and I had to check if there were any logos on my shirts because like the radio broadcast were also shown on video online. So like the corporate is very strict that nothing gets advertised on our channels. That's something that's from Finnish point of view sort of bizarre. Has any American ever thought that it's weird that you have public service that is funded by advertisement? Or is this also like, is this question bizarre to you?
Well, it's interesting that you phrase it like that because when you listen to an NPR podcast, for instance, the sponsorship messages that you get are different than the ones that you would hear if you were just listening to NPR on the radio. Because on the radio, there are very strict rules about the kinds of things that are able to be broadcast in that space. And that has to do with the way that the law is written for the radio licenses to have the bandwidth and the frequency for each station to have. So if you're listening to an NPR podcast, for instance, you might hear an ad for another podcast, which is like has music behind it and has somebody being like, oh, on this podcast, you can learn XYZ. Whereas if you're listening to NPR on the radio, you will only hear an announcer who's going, and saying something like support for NPR comes from entity. And it's something like, just to use an example, Subaru, which is a car manufacturer. And they can't have what's called a call to action. They can't compel you to do something in that message. It can only be explanatory. So it's something along the lines of, Subaru, we have made a new car. You can learn more about this car at this website. We exist as a company.
Okay, yeah.
So that's like, I think, a very sharp contrast to the rest of American media, which is very commercial and has commercials for medicines and films and clothing and alcohol and all sorts of other things. So the contrast between American commercial media, which has advertisements for all sorts of things, to us is very sharp, I think, at least in the eyes of most American consumers. And then going from something like what we do to then something that you would do on YLE, where there's nothing of the sort, would be an even sharper change for American consumers. So I think that we're somewhat in the middle of that spectrum, but I think hewing a bit closer to what the European model would be in that sense.
Yeah,
that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, just to mention a little thing here, I think the weirdest podcast advertisement that I have heard is from Rudy Giuliani podcast, where he was advertising some cigar brand. I don't even remember what that was, but man, that was weird even in the podcast industry.
I haven't heard that, but from what I hear, I think it just suits it really well. Like I can imagine a cigar advertisement on Rudy Giuliani podcast.
Yeah, but NPR has also made news here in Finland because President Trump has threatened to stop the federal funding to NPR and PBS with an executive order. Can you please explain, how does the NPR funding work in a nutshell, and what's the current situation in this regard?
Right. So the way that it works is Congress, when it passed the Public Broadcasting Act in the 1960s that set up NPR and PBS, they created the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And what that does is it's an entity that receives funding from Congress, and public media outlets can apply for grant funding from that entity. So money that NPR's member stations receive from the federal government comes from that as one of their main sources, right? NPR, big NPR, which distributes content and makes content, receives a very small percentage of funding from that entity, and it's mainly for things, receives a small amount of money from that entity. And it can be for things like maintaining emergency broadcast systems, because all of the NPR stations around the country are linked to each other in case there's some sort of natural disaster or an emergency, and you need to get the word out quickly to all of the other television stations and radio stations in an area. NPR helps provide the backbone for that system. It also maintains the public radio satellite system, which is a series of satellites that orbit the Earth that allow people to transmit content back and forth to each other very quickly. It is still, from what I understand, faster than doing it over the internet at this point. So a lot of our stations still have satellite dishes, and that's how they receive content from NPR each and every day. But yeah, the main bulk of that federal funding goes directly to local communities, and it goes to their own individual NPR stations, and that is the crux of how that works. What the president did is he signed an executive order trying to get rid of that money, and it is unclear what will happen next. He has tried also to remove members of the board of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Those removals have been challenged in court, and it remains to be seen what happens there. Congress can, in theory, decide that even though it has allocated money to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, it could decide to take it back. It's unclear whether or not that's going to happen either. So there are a lot of question marks right now as to what could happen next and how that would then impact NPR, how it would impact PBS, and how it would impact the communities that rely on NPR and PBS for sources of news, information, cultural programming, and the like. It's just a lot of open questions right now that it's unclear when we will get any kind of resolution or answers to.
Yeah, and I feel sorry for all NPR workers just like having like this unknown waters that you have to kind of go through before like anything's certain. Like that's always heavy. And yeah, I understand that you have to kind of keep it strict what to comment, but to me it sounds like again the power of the purse has been in the White House recently more than it's been in the Congress. Or what would you say, Tuomo?
Yeah, it sounds like this NPR litigation or situation that's going on. It's an example of the Trump White House, how it has reached out to, all these federal firings, and can he fire certain people who have previously been thought that have been protected from this kind of firings that may be for political reasons, not for some other more understandable reasons. And also, like, can he just take money that Congress has dispersed for people to use? Like, it's the same thing that happened with the USAID, kind of, in the beginning of the year.
Yeah.
But are there, like, discussions now how NPR's funding model could be improved or protected from political pressure? Like, we in Finland, we used to have the system that everyone paid Wiley, in this permit payment.
I think
thing.
it's like TV.
Yeah,
TV licensing permits.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
Something like that. And I remember the days when actually, like, there were officers who went, to knock on people's doors and ask if you have a TV, and if you had TV, like they gave you the bill basically, and nobody opened the door ever during those days, like if they didn't know that someone's coming over. Those were like really weird days, and like sort of like obviously people can think many things about Wiley tax, but at least we don't have to be scared of every knock on the door at this moment. So that's a plus.
So is there a Wiley tax or NPR tax coming, or is it like no one's discussing this there?
Are there any discussions on should this funding model be improved in some ways?
I'm sure if those discussions are happening, they're happening well above my pay grade. I think that there are always, as the market moves and as things change politically, there are always going to be discussions as to how best to do the things that we do and how best to fund the things that we do. But any discussion, I think, that's taking place as to how to change that model. I mean, speaking as someone who's in the newsroom, those conversations are happening on levels that we're not part of because NPR management wants to keep a strict firewall between its business dealings and what it, reports on. So those are conversations that we're just not privy to at this point.
Yeah, sounds reasonable, but it's also interesting that there's no public discussion overall that politicians would be on television and radio demanding some sort of change or anything. So that's more behind the scenes talks currently.
Well, I think you have, and you have for several years, you've had lawmakers who have argued that the government should not be giving any public funding to media because it creates an unfair competitive balance, or they say that the coverage that NPR and PBS provide is not neutral in their eyes.
Sounds familiar discussion.
So those discussions have always taken place, but they have kind of been among, I'm trying to think of how to say this again so I don't get yelled at.
Yeah, no problem.
Those conversations have always happened, but it hasn't impacted the way that federal funding has come through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to NPR and to PBS, at least not yet.
Yeah.
Whether or not that changes, again, who's to say? But I think one of the arguments for keeping things the way that they are, as opposed to just saying, okay, Mackenzie Scott or Melinda French Gates or some big philanthropist just giving NPR $1 billion, is that then they might have an expectation to dictate coverage or to say that we should talk about things one way instead of another. And by having it be public money, then we need to work within the public interest. And that means approaching things from all different perspectives and viewpoints and sides. So that's not necessarily... I think that's a reason that is being cited to try to keep public funding the way that it is.
Yeah. And to me, the public service thing, I think in Finnish perspective, although I'm, working with public broadcasting company, but that sort of thinking also, I think, exists overall in Finnish media, we're all sort of public servants. So that kind of makes sense to keep it that way. In America also, that NPR and PBS would be serving the public in that sort of sense. But I think I want to ask about covering politics in 2025, because also on this very podcast, we have been puzzled many times about what things are so different with Trump 2.0. He's using his executive power in ways that I don't think many of us or any of us have seen before. And you have been producing, what was it, 3 years, NPR Politics podcast. And I don't know how long you have covered overall DC politics, what's happening on the Hill and in the White House. But what it's like from a political reporter perspective, how different times these are, because I believe that there are events that they're so difficult in, for example, legal sense, that it's hard to report sometimes so that you actually know everything's correct in that sense, that you know what type of situation you have in hand.
I think it's like drinking from a fire hose that just never turns off. The thing is, there's already in any administration, there's always just a lot of news that happens, whether it's something from the White House or from different cabinet departments or whatever's going on Capitol Hill. There is just always so much news to cover. And the Trump administration, both in its first term and in its second term so far, have been known to make news at times that are outside the normal news cycle, right? I mean, there's a joke in the U.S. that if you're a celebrity or you're a business or you're a politician or somebody and you want to just and you have to put out a bad news story, like something bad has happened, like you do it on a Friday afternoon, because the theory is that like no one is paying attention. They're just sailing into the weekend. And when you cover Washington, like just anything and everything can happen after 5 o'clock on any day of the week, or even on weekends. There's just no real stop to the news cycle. And that can be challenging just because you get tired, for one, but also it's a matter of trying to figure out what to cover and how best to cover it when, as soon as you finish doing one story, something else pops up and there are 2 other things along with it that you need to do. So I think that we at NPR are lucky that we have a very skilled set of reporters who are covering Washington, who have covered Washington for a very long time, who know the ins and outs of the White House and of Capitol Hill, where Congress is, the Supreme Court. And even when there is so much news that is going on that it's hard to keep track of it, they somehow are able to. And together we're able to create good coverage of what's going on for the American public and for people around the world who are interested in what's going on in America. So the main challenge, I would just say, is the sheer volume of everything. But when you have a good enough team of people working with you, which I'm lucky to do, then it makes things just a little bit easier.
Yeah, and when we visited Washington in February, we actually got to see the recording of NPR Politics podcast, and I was so impressed by the sheer professionalism that you guys had there. I was just blown away. But getting back to Mr. Trump has always been like, maybe not hating journalists, but he has always been this contentious relationship with media. But now I think things are looking different because there are these NPR and PBS funding things. There was the ABC litigation that was settled. There was also the CBS litigation that was also settled, I think. Is there some kind of change how between the relationship of Mr. Trump and the media? Is it harder to cover him now? Or what do you think?
I think there are challenges for sure, but also I think it's also important to put things into context, because adversarial relationships between politicians and the media are nothing new. Famously, there was a lot of hand-wringing and hurt feelings during the Obama administration, especially from national news outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post, because they felt like they weren't getting enough coverage that they wanted to. And the Obama White House really focused its media strategy on talking to local news outlets more than national ones, because they figured that would have more of an impact. And then all of the national news outlets got mad about that. But the Obama White House and the Biden White House also were entities that did not necessarily like to talk to the press or be very open or forthcoming about their relationships with the press or provide them with a lot of information, especially when the press would ask for it. So in terms of just sheer antagonism, there's nothing new there. I think that where things are different here is seeing a president engage in legal action when there is coverage that he doesn't like, which is different. And I don't know what happens after that, if that's just something that will now be normal or not. But that is a change in the traditional, I would say, adversarial nature that the media has with politicians here.
Yeah, I could sort of broaden that up in the sense that I think President Trump and I think even Republicans even more and more, and sort of maybe a little bit on the Democrat side too, like they are sort of creating this antagonistic view of the media in many senses. But do you think that that affects we have been talking about polarization in America too a lot, and how that's sort of increasing year by year. Do you think that this mentality currently, like the relationship between politicians and media is also affecting sort of how people, like the average American people, respond to NPR journalism? Or how do you see that from like overall media perspective of American media?
I think it could be a factor, but it's not the factor, right? If you look at polling, Americans' trust in media and in news has been going down for years. It's not necessarily something new. I think that one of the big changes has been, just a couple generations ago, there were only a few places where you could get your news or your information every day, right? You had 3 major television networks, you had PBS, and you had local and national newspapers. You didn't have cable television, you didn't have satellite television, and you didn't have the internet. And once those became more popular and more prominent in American life, suddenly you could find outlets or programming that aligned more with the way that you saw the world. And I think that when it became possible to have all of these different kinds of sources of information available, trust in the so-called traditional media went down because people thought that, oh, I'm hearing this story about this thing on a website that, I started using a month ago. Why is that not on the evening news every night? Why is that not on my radio news? So I think that it's hard to say that there's any one particular thing that has led to increases in polarization. I'm certainly not an academic, and I don't claim to be one, but I think that
we're podcasters, so we're allowed to throw things in the air.
I think that it could be a contributing factor, but I don't think it's the only reason why people look more skeptically at what media does than they might have used to do in years past.
Yeah. My theory is connected to the disappearance of local news, because, like you said, there used to be local media also besides national media, and now I think especially in USA, but also in Finland, all political commentary in media is national conversation. So when you have a political system that has some local elements to it, like house districts or even states, and you don't have any local conversation, and every conversation becomes nationalized. So that kind of also dumps it down a little bit.
Yeah. And like, I think it's funny. I think it's also coming down to like how technology companies, like, there are now social media companies who dominate and make everything sort of global, because we recently had local elections here in Finland, and people were discussing that, like, they are the least popular elections in Finland, and people are currently following more what's Trump doing in the White House than what are the local politicians doing in Kerava. So people didn't necessarily vote because they're busy with all that sort of stuff. So I think that that's contributing, I think, globally, that people are drawn towards these like global and maybe a bit US-centric discussions, culture wars, if I may say, than like, thinking more, I don't know, local and down-to-earth sort of fights than like, what sort of restrooms there should be in America. Then they should be actually thinking that if they have a swimming hall in Kerava, maybe, for example. But now that I've drawn the whole world into this mess of our podcast, like the change of United States is how United States operates globally is like the biggest concern in Europe currently. Like all the news is full, like how can Finland and Europe sort of take a bigger role in, for example, defense, after United States is expressing that United States doesn't want to be the police of the world anymore, that US is focused more in its own things. Is this something that is like reported on American media, or are Americans talking about like the shift of what's US's role globally? Like, are people there concerned about this at all, or is it like, we are here panicking and sort of, but Americans are just like, yeah, I didn't even know that that's happening over there.
It's certainly something that we have talked about a lot on the NPR Politics podcast, because I think that it is a part of the broader change that we have seen with the Trump administration, right? The Trump administration has wanted to reshape the way that America works for itself and also the way America works for everyone else. And U.S. foreign policy, which has been something that has been greatly consequential for the rest of the world for many, many years, remains so, but in different ways than I think that we've seen before. So, case in point, on the episode that we recorded the Friday before we spoke here, we focused a big part of that about the president's trip to the Middle East, and how one of the interesting things that he said was that the U.S. was no longer in the business of telling countries in the Middle East how they should operate, whether that was through encouraging democratization or promoting human rights or things like that. And that the days of nation building, as the president put it, were over. So it is definitely of interest, I think, to part of the American public, the way that the U.S. is interacting with the world and the way that the world in turn interacts with the U.S. One of, I think, the bigger stories on that front recently, at least here in the U.S., was the U.S. relationship with Canada, because the president referred to Canada as the 51st state a number of times and said that the U.S. needed to absorb Canada. It was in Canada's best interest to become part of the United States. Then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was like, no, that's not happening. And the Canadian election that came after those kinds of remarks led to a victory for the Liberal Party, which had been seen as more willing to stand up to messaging from President Trump on that sense, as well as messaging regarding tariffs and import trade policy with Canada, because Canada is a massive trading partner for the U.S. And I think that was an instance where people were like, oh, Canada, I know Canada. It's up there. I've been there. I've seen it. I know people from Canada. And they realized that, like, oh, the things that, the U.S. says can have consequences in other places. So, yeah, I think that any way you slice it, people pay attention to foreign policy, but it's certainly not the biggest issue that comes to mind, I think, when they're casting their ballots or when they're voting. I think they're tending to focus more on economic issues, how much food prices cost, how much gasoline costs, how much rent and mortgage payments are. But foreign policy is definitely something I think that people pay attention to, even if not in the same capacity as they do other things.
Yeah, I think maybe the tariff chaos, I would say, has maybe brought like the foreign policy more to the table, because like that's one really firm way to actually witness the effects of foreign policy, basically, on everybody's table, basically. And I have to say about the Canada issue that one of the first movies I remember watching, I was 10 years old, and for some reason my mom let me see South Park, the bigger, longer, uncut. What was it? Like the South Park movie.
Yeah, the South Park movie, yeah.
And I've never been more worried about like that movie taking actually place, because that's the movie where U.S. and Canada start a war, and it's ridiculous. But I didn't even imagine that I would follow U.S. politics and start thinking South Park movie just casually. It's been wild times.
Yeah, the main thing I remember from that movie is the Blame Canada song. So I think that like there were a lot of
and what would Brian Fontano do? That's also
yes, people thinking that like that might be the future, but that did not come to pass.
That's great. At this point, I think well, obviously we have to thank NPR Politics podcast because you have given us much like great points that we can forward on to our Finnish audience. Like this is where we actually, confess that we're just, listening to NPR Politics podcast, and just taking all the quotes. We're not doing that. We're not thieves, for Christ's sake. But at this point, we really need some help from you because one of the terms that we have constantly thought about, like what is the correct translation, and this is Attorney General in United States, and maybe more so of the state level, state Attorney General. And in Finnish media, like there are two translations. It's either like the state prosecutor or like the Minister of Justice. And we have been, bowling around between those two options, and maybe more leaning towards like the Minister of Justice side in this sense. But as you follow, European politics and Finnish politics too, especially Stubb and all the Eurovision politics happening, but because you have sort of understanding how like our systems have differences, but can you help us with your knowledge to actually decide like what translation would be better to use?
For state level Attorney General, yeah.
Yes.
I can certainly try my best. So I would say that the Minister of Justice translation, I think, works better for the National Attorney General. So the U.S. has a Department of Justice, which would be like a Ministry of Justice, and the person who runs that is known as the Attorney General. So I would say that like if you're talking about a national level, the National Attorney General is like the Minister of Justice, and here that in the U.S. that's Pam Bondi. Then each state has an Attorney General, which would be like a state prosecutor, and what they do is they represent the state if it is involved in some sort of legal issue, if the state is suing another state or if it is suing a company or something along those lines, then they act as what you often hear is the state's top law enforcement official or like the state's top prosecutor. So New York State has an attorney general who can pursue legal cases where she feels the state has been injured in some way or has received harm, or if there are people in New York that have been harmed, the state of New York itself could pursue charges against an entity, a company, a person, what have you. And then each individual state has someone in that same capacity who is able to do the same thing on behalf of the state itself, if that makes sense.
This is making much more sense. But I have to ask, like, does state level attorney general like have a say, like when there are laws that are being written, like some sort of role in the process in that sense that would, suit more the Minister of Justice role?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it depends largely on each state and how they decide that they craft laws, because, America is 50 states that do things all very differently. And then here in Washington, D.C., which isn't even a state, like we have an attorney general also who does things. So, right, like I don't know if there's an easy one-size-fits-all answer to that, but I would say that, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to that.
Yeah, so I think like the state prosecutor is the thing we go from now on, because this has been like, we have been trying to, Google stuff and everything, and it's like really unclear where's the sort of difference between the national level and then the state level. Obviously, the state level embraces more that state prosecutor role, but I was like, but still they share the same title sort of than the national level. So what's going on?
Yeah, it was a nightmare in the 2024 primaries in the Republican side when they started like taking away Mr. Trump's right to run in the primaries. And I was just Googling, like, what does this person do? Like, what kind of authorities he or she has?
And the thing, too, with a state-level attorney general is it's someone who's elected, right? So it's someone who runs for office like other politicians do, whereas the national attorney general or the minister of justice, is someone who's appointed by whoever the government is, right? So in each state, you have people who are running to be that law enforcement official, and whoever wins the most votes then ends up getting to serve in that office and may pursue things, based on whatever they campaigned on.
Perfect. Thank you. Now we're much wiser and know how to, we know the correct term to use from now on. And at this point, we'll move to our last piece or section that we use in our podcast. This is called There's a Tweet Behind Everything, but currently I think it stands for There's a Post Behind Everything, because, when Musk took over X and it was unclear if X, was going to be online anymore after all those buggy days when he just sacked so many people out there, and sometimes we just couldn't open it. So we need to take our political memes from all around the internet, although I think X currently stands as a king of political memery, I would say. But this time it comes from Instagram, because I remember seeing this originally on X, but I couldn't find the original post anymore. So I guess, it's gone, and it
became so popular it made its way to Instagram.
Yes. I don't know if this is the way things usually go, but I guess this is the way currently. This is now on Instagram, and I have no idea where this originated. So if it's first on Reddit or somewhere. So I apologize if someone has witnessed the original one. But this time this is about the Pope, because we have been following the selection of the new Pope, and now we have Leo 14th, I guess, XIV. So yeah, 14th. This post comes from a Instagram user called Violinish Star, Ishtar Hernandez, full name, and I think I just cannot pronounce this because I think this needs some singing. But this is a quote from Laura Loomer, and I'm sure at this point Casey already knows what the quote might be. But the quote goes from Ishtar's own post into Laura Loomer's original X comment on Pope's Twitter account. And the song goes like this. Cut my life into pieces. This is woke Marxist Pope. I'm sorry, everybody who loves Papa Roach for many reasons. But yeah, cut my life into pieces. This is woke Marxist Pope. This goes perfectly with the original song, which is also like a great nostalgic song. I just don't want to admit it. But Laura Loomer commented on Robert Francis Prevost's X account as he was elected Pope on May the 8th. And I have to say, like, after that, I've never seen so many Pope memes. And obviously this is because America is now the centerpiece of Catholic Church. And now you have Pope who follows baseball. And I think it was Red Sox, maybe? Like he was...
White Sox.
White Sox.
Yeah.
I think, is there a Red Sox team? Like
yes, the Red Sox are in Boston, and then the White Sox are in Chicago, and he's from Chicago, so he's a White Sox fan.
Sorry about the Sox, people from Chicago. But how has the new Pope affected? Have you just witnessed sort of the Pope becoming this celebrity in the United States, and have people been actually following Catholic Church politics now that you have an American Pope for the first time?
Well, the first thing I'll say is I hope that the Pope, broadens his sports consumption and finds a Pesapalo team to support also.
I'm a former Oulun Lippo player. Before it was, Oulun Lippo was caught organizing their games like they paid and they broke the law in many ways and that team just vanished. But as a kid, I used to play with Oulun Lippo and they were the greatest because they had the money to pay for it.
Too much information, Sami. Please, Casey, go on.
Yes, but I like to educate Americans about the great laji of pesäpallo.
I think, a lot of people have been paying attention to Pope Leo XIV's election to the papacy because, I don't think anybody expected that there would be an American pope for a number of reasons. But I think that what's interesting too is Catholicism and broadly the intersection of religion and politics is always something that is of note in the United States. Very famously, there have been a number of high-profile Democratic politicians, Joe Biden being one of them, Nancy Pelosi, the former Speaker of the House, another.
I think Chuck Schumer, the Senate leader, recently published... Is he? He's Jewish,
He's Jewish,
right?
yeah.
Okay,
he's Jewish, yeah.
Yeah, but sorry, I was confused. But religion has a big role in American politics, and Catholics are a huge part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and the thing with this former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi is because Pelosi and Biden support abortion rights, their home Catholic diocese said that they couldn't receive Eucharist because that was a violation of Catholic doctrine. So there's always been this kind of interesting, not necessarily tension, but relationship between religion and politics and how one influences the other. So it will be interesting to see, especially how there are some people who are more conservative Catholics and how they will interpret the news of a pope whose policies, I mean, he's only been in the job a couple of weeks, so we don't really know. But if his policies tend to be aligned more with those of Pope Francis, which had a somewhat more open view of things, let me say that differently, align with the views of Pope Francis, who had somewhat of a more friendly approach to things like immigration policy or the role of women in the church to an extent, or LGBTQ rights, whether they react to a new pope continuing on in that vein in a different sense. I think that will be something interesting to watch.
Tuomo, what has been your take on the woke Marxist pope? Do you think that Catholic Church is now too communist for the world?
I just think that looking forward to 2026 midterms, the Pope holds the worst positions. He's tough on abortion and he's soft on immigration. So that's not a combination for the U.S. politics.
All right. I think that's our podcast this time. Casey, it was a pleasure and an honor to have you on our very small podcast here in Finland. But it's been really eye-opening and really insightful, learning more about what's going on in your newsroom compared to what's happening in ours.
Well, Sami, Tuomo, kiitos again for having me on, and I look forward to getting back to Finland sometime soon.
That would be great. And, then we can go watch some pesäpallo here in Helsinki.
It's a plan.
Yeah, Hyvinkään Tahko. I think that's the nearest team that we have here in Helsinki.